Oil, Russia requires oil prices to be $110 a barrel for economic growth to take place in Russia. However, Market Watch points out that today, oil prices are extremely unprofitable at $40 a barrel, meaning that the oil market is equally unprofitable and that Russia is currently in a trend of perpetual economic decline. Our sole contention is that sanctions prevent economic diversification away from oil dependence. They view this in two ways. Subpoint A, lowering foreign direct investment. FDI is critical to spurring economic diversification. Garbage of the Economic Expert Group notes, FDI is the major channel where advanced technologies reach emerging markets. With sanctions in place, Russia's isolation from the world's most efficient technologies will prevent its modernizations. This is critical. As Shape Conserve Charles University explains, Russia presently lacks the technology necessary for the diversification of other non-oil sectors, and sanctions reduces crucial FDI. The Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment writes, uncertainty over future sanctions is eroding trust over Russia's political stability, an essential requirement for attracting foreign direct investment. All in all, the RBTH calculates $151 billion of assets have been moved out of Russia because of sanctions. And the Global Economic Outlook Group notes net FDI is negative in light of recent political developments spurred on by sanctions. Subpoint B, encouraging high-skilled immigration. Absent highly skilled workers, Russia cannot diversify. Andrew Bauer of Boston College explains that high-skilled workers are needed to rejuvenate entrepreneurship, which is key to creating new technology and innovation necessary for diversification away from oil. Fortunately, sanctions encourage highly skilled laborers to leave Russia. The Institute of Modern Russia notes the country's brightest minds in finance and tech are leaving directly because sanctions limit their access to capital markets abroad and Western opportunities. Ultimately, they quantify emigration numbers nearly broke the all-time high of 215,000 people leaving Russia. And Reuters writes, Russia is leading exactly the kind of people it needs to diversify away from oil. Subpoint C, the threats. Ultimately, preventing the diversification of Russia's economy has reduced three threats to the West. First, the Arctic threat. Wendy Lawrence of the Maritime Executive magazine writes, Russia is engaging in massive military buildups in the Arctic, occupying it with thousands of troops and new nuclear-powered submarines. She says Russia's Arctic presence is a direct threat to Western security, as military dominance in the Arctic would give strategic military positioning, shifting the power balance. However, because of the sustained economic downturn that is created without diversification, the Brookings Institute writes, the severe economic crisis of oil makes Russia's militarization in the Arctic inevitable. Second, the invulnerability threat. Trapping Russia as an unprofitable, oil-driven country ensures its decreased volatility. Ross from the Center of European Policy Studies explains earlier, oil market profitability created this feeling of strength and invulnerability, making Russia more assertive and ready to deploy its military power. But the current drop in prices will thus bring a much less aggressive Russian stance. In fact, Colgan and the Watson Institute of International Affairs notes oil-focused countries are 2.5 times less likely to engage in military conflict when their prices are low. Maria Segoger from the Washington Post does the comparison. When oil was $25 a barrel in the 2000s, Putin didn't mind NATO enlargement and befriended the West. But in 2014, with oil prices high, Putin invaded Ukraine to punish them for their policies he supported back in 2002. Third, the general aggression threat. Russia's finance minister Anton Sulanov writes, because of the unprofitable oil market, if oil prices maintain their current levels, Russia's reserve will be completely exhausted by 2016. Gaddy, senior fellow at the Diplomat Impacts, noting that Russia currently relies on this reserve fund to conduct military operations. In fact, the Aspen Institute writes, it was its financial reserves that Russia relied upon to fund the annexation of Crimea and invest in the region. Thus, the Business Insider explains, this reserve fund deficit spending depletion can only be maintained for 2 years before Russia must pull out of Ukraine. Moreover, McCormack from UPenn furthers, the sanctions regime independently made operating costs too high, preventing the full Russian seizure of Kiev. Please refer.
We negate that on balance, economic sanctions are reducing the threat Russia poses to Western interests, and contention one is that the empire strikes back. There are 4 reasons why sanctions increase Russian aggression, and the first is nationalism. Sanctions offer a unique ability for Putin to boost nationalist sentiment, as according to Laskin of the Journal of Political Risk in 2015, international isolation caused by sanctions allows the target government to control ideas and information within their society and nurture nationalism. Bertoli of UC Berkeley in 2013 confirms that nationalism can undermine international cooperation, motivate societies to fight costly wars, and cause governments to overestimate their relative military power. Second is oligarchs. Targeted sanctions on business oligarchs are shifting Russia's political hierarchy. Weather of the Week in 2014 explains that Putin has cost the most valuable Russian businessmen companies hundreds of billions of dollars in market value. As a result, Leonard of the European Council on Foreign Relations in 2014 writes that sanctions have marginalized pro-Western members of the elite, while military hardliners have been strengthened more than before. As a result, We Are Christian Science Monitor in 2015 finds that members of Russia's military security establishment are now shaping the Kremlin's foreign policy. These hardliners are the reason why Ukrainian rebels are still pushing their offensive and talking of building a 100,000-strong reserve army to bring the fight to Kiev. Third is anti-Westernism. Sanctions provide the perfect cover for Moscow to redirect its attention from failed economic policies and blame the West. Pelchuk in 2014 writes in Salon magazine that Putin has sidestepped the severity of Russia's tanking economy. Instead, he blames the West for attempting to sabotage his country, comparing Western sanctions against Russia to Adolf Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. Symes of the National Interest in 2015 writes that with 66% of Russians believing that Western sanctions are meant to weaken and humiliate Russia, many have rallied around the flag and embraced Putin as protector against foreign onslaught. Many regard sanctions as an assault on themselves in addition to their country. Fourth is economic harms. Sanctions are contributing significantly to Russia's economic woes. Bokhani at PBS writes in 2015 that because of sanctions, no financial institutions have dared to provide Russia with any financing. As a result, Russia cannot mitigate its recession by borrowing money. In addition to losing a safety net, Dresner in 2015 also finds that in 2014, more than $150 billion in private sector capital left Russia to avoid the prospect of sanctions. The Economist in 2015 furthers that Russians value two qualities: wealth and military strength. The less Putin can provide of the former at home, the more he must demonstrate the latter abroad. Goryev in 2014 of the Financial Times furthers that recession means Russia's government can no longer use money to buy public acceptance. Repression and propaganda have to take up the slack. Nothing could be more helpful than a small, victorious military adventure. It has spawned an aggressive foreign policy to which Western leaders are now struggling to respond. There are two main places where Russia has increased aggression against the West in the real world, and the first is Ukraine. According to Gibbons Neff of the Washington Post, as of just New Year's Eve, a true ceasefire is way off. The fact that the number of ceasefire violations in the last weeks of December had increased in eastern Ukraine reflects a worrying development as the year ends. In December, there was a marked increase in fighting. Second is Syria. Ward of the Star in 2015 reports that Russia's military action in Syria is a ploy to ease Western sanctions that punish Moscow for its incursions into Ukraine. Throughout the entire world, conflict between the West and Russia has increased. Soldatkin of Reuters in 2016 confirms that as a result of this aggression, a new Russian appraisal names the U.S. as one of the greatest threats to Russian national security for the first time. Letsky of Texas A&M in 2007 quantifies finding that sanctions increase the probability of militarized conflict by 17%. Oliphant of the Telegraph in 2015 reports that Russia and NATO are actively preparing for war in Europe amidst the greatest buildup of military tension in Europe since the end of the Cold War. And for these reasons, we strongly negate.
All right, is everyone ready? That sanctions are going to Russia's economy, right?
Yeah.
Do you have a question?
Sure. Was Russia diversifying before sanctions?
Yes. It was taking multiple steps according to the call back from the Chinese people. Can I ask you a question?
What are those multiple steps?
Like it was taking processes and eliminating obstacles to diversification. It was trying to diversify actively.
Were those working?
I mean, they were actually taking steps, right?
No. You're being super broad about this.
Here's why it's important, right?
What are those steps and were they working?
Here's why it's important, right? Before sanctions, they were at least trying to diversify. Now, they're not trying at all.
But
so it doesn't matter.
Just because they were trying, if it wouldn't have worked, then you literally have zero impact. So I'm asking you, was it
Why
working?
wouldn't it have worked?
Because I'm asking you if it was working. This is something that you need to prove.
Yes, and so the steps are at least a lot better than they were trying
How
to
much
now
better?
they're not doing anything
Are they
right?
a lot better?
Wait, hold on, wait. Let's just analyze this, right? The benefit of this is it's a comparative benefit, right? So in one world, right, without sanctions, you don't have any diversification, or with sanctions, you don't have any diversification. The other, you're at least taking steps, right?
I understand
You
that
can make an analysis of like the ethics, right? I just don't know these specific.
Please speak. I understand that you're trying to go for prerequisite impact, right? But a prerequisite doesn't become an impact until you prove probability of that happening without the prerequisite. So I'm asking you, what was the probability?
So I can read you analysis of like the actual policy measures, right? I don't know them off the top of my head. I'm not a Russian expert.
I'm not even asking,
right?
like, I'm further than just like specifically what were they. I'm just asking what was the efficacy of them.
So like we're saying that they're a lot better. It's a comparative benefit. Like that's what we're
You're
saying.
not answering my. I understand that you're accessing a prerequisite impact,
Yes.
but I'm saying that it doesn't really become an impact until you prove that that would happen without sanctions.
Okay,
Or
so
some
if we prove that it would have happened without sanctions, then do we like basically gain access to our case?
Yeah, I would no,
Okay.
well, not completely.
Yes.
Well, I think that we could still. I think that we could still outweigh it, right?
Oh, no. So we
Like,
gain
sure,
access to our
yeah,
case,
it
right?
makes your life easier for sure. Yes.
So if we gain access to our case, right?
I don't. Like Harrison is going to put other responses to your case than just this.
Go for it. All right.
Yeah, we will. We will.
Okay. So you talk about like this anti-Westernism, right?
I do.
Like yeah.
Yeah, I do.
Yes. Right. Like what's the date of this analysis?
The data.
The date. On this
The
analysis.
date. I don't remember off the top of my head. If you want, I can like run there and grab it and then tell you.
No, that's okay. So basically, right, your internal link to like increasing aggression here is that there's an increase in anti-American sentiment, right?
Yeah, although I'm pretty sure we don't read a date and case that's earlier than 2014. So I think it's at least that.
That's great. No, I'm just asking, like, your internal link to aggression for your third point is that there's anti-American sentiment, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I just for clarity, do you have a question?
We only have like 10 seconds. I don't think
I mean, all the time.
First, as a very important observation, they need to prove that even if Russia has the intent to be aggressive in the long term with sanctions, they're actually going to have the capability to carry out this aggression. Capability is always a prerequisite. But second, let's clarify this diversification point. Ishan tells you from China Daily that prior to sanctions, they were trying to diversify. Well, they say, how would they actually be successful? Sarah tells you that the reason why they would be successful is because Western technology is needed in order to diversify. They don't give you any warrant as to why they wouldn't diversify absent sanctions. We tell you that Western tech is needed, therefore that's how. Now, let's go into their only details. They first talk about nationalism. The problem with this is that in both worlds, Putin is going to want to increase nationalism. They don't tell you that with sanctions, there's a unique increase. They don't really quantify this at all. Logically, Putin's always going to want to increase nationalism. He doesn't tell you how it's actually going to increase. But second, they talk about oligarchs. One, they don't actually prove the extent of the influence of these oligarchs. But second of all, even if these oligarchs are more militarily aggressive, if we prove in the long term their capability to actually aggress goes down, we win that point. Third, they talk about anti-Western sentiments. When you look to all their statistics, all of their polls, they're from June of 2015. We post-date this with The Economist from December of 2015, who explains that 75% of Russians want to improve relations with the West. That's very crucial because the more sanctions progress, they themselves concede that the economy is being hurt. That's why Russian citizens know, unless they cooperate with the West, in the long term, there's not going to be any sort of solution to the significant economic downturn that's occurring in the status quo. At that point, you can look at the fact that Putin's approval rating is really low, and 60% of Russians don't want to re-elect him. In the long term, we're seeing a reduction in Putin's support and an increase in Western cooperation after sanctions have been imposed. But fourth, they talk about economic crimes. They essentially concede that it's hurting the economy. Insofar as that's true, even if you don't buy the diversification impact or the diversification warrant, we can still link into our impacts in our case insofar as we tell you that the reason why they can't actually fund their military is because their reserves are being depleted and their economy is really bad. But now, let's talk about a few things. First, they talk about Ukraine. They say that ceasefires haven't happened. Remember, McCormick and UPenn tells you that even if ceasefires haven't been effective, the reason why it's comparatively better to have sanctions because McCormick tells you that absent sanctions, they would have actually seized Kiev and been more aggressive. The warrant is operating costs. They themselves tell you that the sanctions are hurting their economy. McCormick tells you that because of this, they can't expand as well as they can. Second, they talk about fighting in Syria. You can look to The Guardian, who tells you that the reason why they're actually going to Syria is because they want to secure crucial energy markets. And second of all, Assad is a crucial ally in the region, and right now there's escalation in the region. Either way, you'd be going in. The only difference is sanctions prevent them in the long term of actually going in when they cut off their capability to do so. It's a comparative benefit, which they never really address. But then, let's talk about how they say that Reuters says it's the greatest threat. And they are essentially this Letsky evidence that says there's a 70% increase in conflict. It's not Russia specific. Look to McCormick, who says that there's actually been a reduction in that insofar as there's a decrease in aggression. But then, at the end, they essentially say that they're going to go to war with Europe. The problem with this argument is, one, they don't actually prove the probability of them going to full-out war with Europe, insofar as we tell you that, one, Arctic aggression is a far more probable thing, insofar as in the status quo, they're already trying to expand the Arctic, and two, aggression in Ukraine is being decreased, that's always going to be better off in the long term. So at the end of the day, the way you vote for us is very, very simple. Even if they prove that the intent to attack goes up, if we prove that the capacity to attack goes down, then we can win this round. They themselves tell you that the economy of Russia is being hurt. We tell you that because of this, according to the Russian finance minister, by 2016, the reserves will be completely depleted. They tell you that because of this, since Russia uses the reserve funds to finance all their military operations, anything that they talk about in today's round, whether it be in Syria or Ukraine, isn't sustainable in the long term.
Start off with an overview. Remember, credibility and intent are going to outweigh capability, because at the end of the day, Russia is the first most powerful military in the world. What does that mean? Bumping them down through oil prices does not degrade their military capacity to make them even to enough to 10th, 15th, even 20th. They can still attack Ukraine and other surrounding areas if they need to. Moreover, this China daily evidence that they claim is the evidence that Russia was diversifying before sanctions, A, does not say that Russia actually had access to Western technology at that time that it was using to diversify, but B, it also said that Russia had much more steps to take. Realize their entire case is dependent upon the link that diversification had a probability in Russia prior to sanctions. But the problem is, Nick Ottens of the Atlantic Sentinel in 2012 found that Vladimir Putin and his deputy had been talking about diversification for decades, when in reality they had actually been taking steps that were contrary to diversification. What they were actually doing is funding the oil and natural gas industries, because those were the industries in that country that worked, and they didn't want to go through the painful process of diversification in the first place. That is a prerequisite card to their entire case, because we proved that there was zero probability of this even happening in the status quo. But let's go into their specific links. First, they tell you that lowering FDI is good because FDI somehow would increase diversification. But this is actually not true, because if FDI was in the country, diversification would actually be going down even more. Because essentially, what Alberta Abada of the economic study groups explains is that FDI in resource countries often goes towards those resource sectors because of the way that comparative advantage works. In an open market economy, people invest in the sectors that are strongest in a particular country. So when the resource market, which is the strongest market in Russia, is the strongest economy, that is literally where all of the FDI inflows flow. At the end of the day, they are not proving a decrease in diversification. But let's go into their subpoint B, where they talk about highly skilled workers leaving. First of all, they don't actually show you that people are on, that migration is on net increasing. They just show you that people leaving the country is increasing. However, that's not taking into account people who are coming into the country. In fact, Mark Anonymous of IntelliNews explains that the number of people from abroad is significantly coming into Russia is significantly higher than the people who are leaving. That means there's no brain drain. But secondly, Anonymous also explains that people often leave for a short period of time and then come back. At the end of the day, they're not proving a long-term decrease in this brain drain. But third, and most importantly, they don't actually prove to you that the people who are leaving are the high-skilled workers who are necessary for this Western technology. They try to give you a warrant that says that people are scared off by the Russian economy, but A, people would already be scared off by the Russian economy, but B, essentially we tell you that 67% of Russians feel like the West is hostile towards them, therefore they wouldn't want to take refuge in the West. Their only response to this is that 75% of Russians want better relations with the West. We tell you that that's because Russians feel like the West is aggressing on them. They don't feel safe in Western countries. Let's go to the impact level. First, they tell you that the Arctic threat goes down. But essentially, Miralov explains that Russian oil companies are still working in the status quo to expand their Arctic operations, which will in the long term fund Russian militarism in that region. But B, they don't even explain you an impact of that. Then they tell you that oil market prices leads to more conflict. But essentially, look to our whole narrative where we tell you that declining economic strength is the root cause of Russian aggression. That comes to you from Wood, who tells you that essentially Russia's challenge to the West is entirely predicated on these economic conditions. They wouldn't be aggressing otherwise, because essentially that is the way that Putin power projects. Our narrative essentially that according to Harry Hale, that Russia wouldn't even be aggressing into Ukraine in the first place had it not been for these Russia wouldn't be invading into the rest of Ukraine had it not been for sanctions. The reason why this is, Hale explains that they don't have a strategic interest in the region because that's not where the ethnic concentration was. That also applies to the third impact, which is an increase in the Ukrainian conflict. We tell you that essentially the only reason why violence still continues in Ukraine today is because sanctions are giving an alternate reason for Russia to stick along.
So you're overview that Russia has a really big country, right?
Yeah.
They don't have actual money to carry
how high is the cost of actually using that military?
Okay, so any sort of military operation costs money, right?
How much?
Well, I don't know how much exactly,
You have to
but
show
the
me.
Russian finance minister tells you that by 2016, the reserves are going to be completely depleted. Anything is
Let's
going
talk
to be like
about, so let's talk about,
right?
let's talk about that evidence. What does your Business Insider evidence say? The sentence after you read, or
No, I'm
that's
talking
the
about-
second half of
that's a
the
different
evidence.
piece. That's a different piece.
But that's the way that you link the
No,
content.
that's-
Those are completely
no.
the same argument.
Wait, no. The Business Insider evidence is specific to Ukraine. The
Wait,
Russian
what?
finance minister evidence is
Yeah.
talking about the reserves,
Well,
which
what-
like
what
fund
the-
all military
but,
operations.
like, let's look at the way that your evidence all like kind of contradicts. So the International Business Times evidence that you read says that Russia will deplete its reserves and it will have to withdraw unless they go through major fiscal adjustment, which is what they have been doing. They cut their overall spending by 10%, but increased military spending by 33%.
Okay, so right now they're doing that, but in the long term, that's not sustainable. They can't keep
Why not?
cutting forever, right?
So they
That'll lead to
increase
economic
taxes.
collapse.
Wait,
No, their economy, like you said, is already really bad right now. They
did-
can't just keep cutting and increasing taxes for us,
I mean,
right?
lots of countries have like increased
Wait,
taxes. Wait,
that
you
doesn't-
don't show me that the cost is high enough.
Have they increased
Wait, no,
taxes
hold
in
on,
status quo?
hold on. This is really important. You don't show me that the cost of conducting military operations is high enough that would force Russia down a completely unsustainable spending path where they never would be able to raise enough taxes or cut enough spending to compensate. That is a huge impact that you need to prove the brink of.
Okay, first of all, you don't prove that they're doing either of those things, but second of all,
I
the Russian...
prove to you that they're cutting right now.
Wait, where? From what sectors?
From Reuters tells you that they're cutting 10% overall from all sectors while still maintaining a 33%
So in
increase
the
in
long
military.
term, can they keep cutting from those sectors?
Sure, why not? You don't give me a reason why not.
Wait, because in the long term, like you said, their economy is really bad, so if they keep cutting, they're simply
Okay.
perpetuating a really bad economy, right?
First of all, why do cuts in regular sectors like all have like some huge negative impact on the economy?
Okay, because they're taking money from investment in those sectors that's obviously going to be bad, right? And you tell me that their economy is bad. Obviously, they're not going to
But
continue
if-
to take policy actions.
Hold on.
They're going to make their economy worse when sanctions are already hurting them
Hold on.
really badly,
You
right?
don't prove to me that their economy gets worse enough as a result of these cuts to fundamentally make the spending unsustainable. You're
No,
making
that's
a
what,
lot of...
that's what the Russian finance minister tells me.
No,
He says
that's not what the Russian finance
He
minister
says
tells
they're
me.
going to be completely depleted, as in they don't have any money to carry out this military
Only
aggression.
that specific reserve fund that they're tapping into
What other
now.
reserve fund do they use? Because Gady tells you that all of their military operations are coming from that reserve fund.
Okay, in the status quo, wait, hold on, we're going to need to see that evidence.
Yeah.
But second of all, that's, okay, great. Do you, we only have 10 seconds left.
We're gonna run a little bit of time. How much do we have left?
47.
A lot more than 10. They get up here and tell you that, oh, like Russia still has a pretty large military, they can still be pretty damaging. Recognize that military operations also cost a lot of money. In order to finance those operations, they have to rely on the reserve fund. That's what the finance minister literally tells you, that's what Gady tells you. That's really critical because if we prove that the reserve fund is decreasing as a result of the economy, you can easily affirm that without my list going on their case. They make, like, first make them respond to the economist who said that literally turns their analysis about the increasing in anti-American sentiment. He says that post-dating their analysis, 75% of people want to improve relations with the West, so you turn their increase in aggression, we access intent right there. But next, remember, go to diversification. They say we have to prove like diversification wouldn't happen before. Not only do you tell you China Daily, who says that they were actively taking steps, which they respond that, oh, like, we need, like, much more were needed. That's the entire analysis, right? They were actually taking steps, much more were needed, but they were still taking steps, which is really important because it shows that they were actually taking actions. They said Putin was talking before about like not wanting to diversify, but like that doesn't really make sense. Insofar as right before sanctions were imposed, they were actively taking steps to diversify. That's really critical. But lastly, even if you ignored everything I just said, they never prove a single warrant why Russia would not want to diversify. Make them prove that if you want to uphold this response. Next, go to our case, or go to our warrants. First, we tell you that Russia is like bleeding exactly the kind of people it needs to diversify. That's exactly what Reuters tells you. They say we don't. It's not unique. It's not because of sanctions. What they fail to realize is that IMR says it's directly because of sanctions. 215,000 people are leaving. Remember what Ballin tells you. These people are critical to generate innovation necessary for diversification. That's really critical because we get access to our fourth impact. Remember, this is really important because we see if they can't diversify away from oil, then the reserve fund is going to be depleted by 2016. But next, that Gady tells you that's what they use to finance their operations. Next, overall, they like even if you want to buy like none of diversification happens, their own entire case, decreasing the economy, is the reason why our reserve fund is depleting right now. So you still affirm, even if you want to ignore any of our words, even if you want to ignore diversification, their entire analysis, the reserve fund is decreasing because of the fall of oil prices, the economy, that's really critical.
Everybody? diversification. The real piece of evidence that he has is his Daily Mail evidence. But what he never responds to is what Harrison says, was that Daily China evidence never talks about how Russia was receiving Western technology, which they themselves say is the prerequisite to achieving diversification. They prove no efficacy of the attempts that Russia was trying to use. But in even more, you can extend the cold drop terms that Harrison reads in rebuttal. The first comes from Abada, who says that FDI increases the amount, or decreases the amount of diversification because people invest in the oil resource areas of the economy. Not only that, but even when Putin said, even when they say that they were taking steps to diversify, they were actually doing the opposite. Remember what Harrison says, which is that Putin was funding the oil technology. And that's really, like, it makes a lot of sense because that, as they say, that's where 70% of their economy comes from. You obviously want to maximize production from there. Now on human capital, finally, they don't tell you the magnitude of the human capital that's lost. But what Harrison says, and also gets not unresponded to, is that people tend to come back, and not only that, they don't take into account the people that are coming into a country. Now, first of all, that this is all really important because now that they're delinked from diversification, Ishan says specifically that that's why they have to draw from their reserve fund. But even if you don't want to buy that, you can vote for us anyway, right? Because what they never respond to is the Gibbons-Neff card, which says that destabilization is at its highest levels and fighting is continuing in Ukraine. The situation on the ground is unchanged. Even if they prove to you at the end of the day that troops are going to be withdrawn, the CSIS says that this is just going to be replaced with another type of military incursion. They don't prove to you any net benefit, but what we show to you through the oligarchs, which gets severely unresponded to, is that this actually increases the amount of aggression that Russia wants, specifically because the anti-Western oligarchs have their monies abroad, and after sanctions freeze those monies, they no longer have the influence. It is the hardliners that have the influence, and 100,000, and those hardliners are the ones that want to send 100,000 troops into Ukraine. At the end of the day, conditions on the ground for now are unchanged, and Russia has the economic capacity to go further.
So the crossfire, stay here.
All right.
So you say that sanctions hurt Russian economy. How do they finance military aggression in war?
Okay, it's just because they hurt the economy doesn't take away the ability to finance the military.
Here's the problem, right? The Russian finance minister tells you that with the economy as it is right now, by 2016, the reserves will
Wait, no, can I try to say something? Okay. So what I extend in summary is that there are just different types of destabilization. One is occupation, and one is things like terrorism, subterfuge.
Terrorism?
Yeah, that's what the CSIS says.
What do you mean terrorism? Like who are they? Are
They're
they backed
funding,
terrorists?
yeah, they're funding Russian-backed separatists who are causing destabilization.
Okay, so
This is what the
funding them.
CSIS says. If
How
you
do
want
they
to see it,
fund
you
them?
can.
How do they fund them?
Okay, that is not nearly as
Wait, hold on,
expensive
let me ask you
as
something.
full-on
Let me ask you
occupation.
something. Wait.
The Russian finance minister says it's going to be completely depleted. They
No,
literally can't fund
Wait,
anything.
so let me ask you
Finance-
something. One second. Does this funding of terrorists come from the defense budget?
I'm not really sure.
Okay.
Yeah, it probably would, right? Because it's funding like actual operations, military operations. That would probably come from the defense budget, right?
Well, it's your maybe. I mean,
If we can see that,
Putin even kind of denies that he's funding these separatists, even though
right.
the conditions
But if
on the
it's
ground
going
show
to
the
come from
opposite.
somewhere in the government, it's going to come from the defense budget, right?
No, not necessarily.
Wait, what?
Not everything is. Not everything in a budget is itemized.
One, Gady tells you that all of their military aggression right now is being funded by the reserve fund. Two, you don't read any evidence that says they have any other source of revenue for their military. Can you hear the question?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to ask this again, but on diversification, since this is really the link to the reserve fund argument as you presented in summary.
Well, the other link that we give you
But,
is
I mean, the only one that you
foreign
extend,
indicates.
the only one that you extend into the summary, to quote Ishan, is that because they can't diversify, they're going to run out of their reserve fund.
No.
Also-
I explicitly in summary literally said they can see the economy decreases. That's why the Russian Russian finance minister literally said with a bad economy and
Well, regardless,
spurred on by
I'm
sanctions,
just
they
going
can't
to get to my question, right? So what is the probability that diversification was going to work below
This is
sanctions?
really
Let's say the reserve,
The China Daily explains that they were trying to diversify. You don't give any warrant as to why absent sanctions they wouldn't be able to. Kusera tells you that Western technology
let's say
is-
actually,
No, we do say why
This is-
absent
hold on.
sanctions. Okay.
let's say the reserve funds are totally depleted. Doesn't that just mean they're in debt?
It
no.
means they don't have money to actually finance. Okay, first of all, this is like a really late response in the round. It really doesn't matter. But second of all, you can look to the fact that Gady tells you they're funding all their military aggression through the reserve fund. So like they're not going to like
Alright,
have
you guys
to.
have questions?
They're also not stupid enough to just let themselves run out of money.
Okay, this is a really
Like,
late
that's why
response in
your
the
own.
round.
But
No, I
that's
tell
what's
you that your
occurring,
own,
like, right?
your own
We're
international
analyzing the
business
general
stuff.
trend right now, right, Harrison? And that's what's occurring right now. As a result of this like economic decline, the
Also,
reserve fund is going to be depleted by
The fact that
That's
the
like a
reserve
fact.
fund is going to be depleted is reliant on the fact that occupation is going to continue, but I tell you that the type of aggression is shifting.
That doesn't matter insofar as that's still so like they
You
still need
said-
to
you
fund
said
these
no,
operations.
because
You're changing the cost.
Myers Park High School and Ms. Lynn Coyne, who unfortunately could not be with us today. Mr. Lavoy and I are very proud to serve as your impromptu tournament directors. We had a great time. We hope you guys did as well. Congratulations to all of the competitors, especially to our 2 finalist teams. On a 9-0 student vote for a 4-1 final decision, the winner of the 2016 PF Challenge is Polly French.